Welcome to episode 2 of the CSEC podcast. This episode is Diversification and Social Justice. I'm your host, Jennifer Scuro, faculty in philosophy at Molloy University. And today's guests include Sami Schalk, associate professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at UW-Madison. Dr. Schalk's books include Bodyminds Reimagined and Black Disability Politics. Devonya Havis is associate professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Buffalo. Her recent book is Creating a Black Vernacular Philosophy. And then finally, DJ Mitchell is the inaugural Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Molloy University. This episode was subsidized in part by a small Molloy DEI grant, and we really appreciate the support. Content warning: some of our discussion will include state-sponsored violence, anti-Black racism. It is about social justice, so we hope you get a lot from the conversation.
My name is Devonya Havis. I am by training a philosopher in the continental tradition, specifically oriented in phenomenology, modern French philosophy, and I am based in the tradition of Black radical thought, also Africana philosophy. And Jen asked me to talk a little bit about my recent book, which is called Creating a Black Vernacular Philosophy. The book comes deeply out of the tradition in which I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, surrounded by people who were engaged in the Black freedom movement, which has come to be known as the civil rights movement. These were foundational ancestors, elders, people in struggle who shaped the way I think, not only as a philosopher, but the critical ways in which I think, and also grounded my commitments to social justice. And so the book really wants to understand the intersection between ethics and politics that is at play, especially when we talk about people who have been racialized. And most importantly, it is a way to talk about the critical philosophical positions that already exist within Black traditions. And so I wanted to highlight that and put it into conversation with the more academic and formalized philosophy that I encountered as a graduate student and as a high school student. Creating a Black vernacular philosophy, which is part of what I think is so cool about your work, is that it really draws upon the cultural resource of not only Black women, but people who have used various strategies to create joy and find and create meaning in their lives. So it's not simply a tale about oppression. And that's really what I've been trying to work out and theorizing. In fact, it is a critical stance with regard to institutions that make life not livable. So it's really, it's not resilience, because I'm kind of like, don't make me be resilient in the face of unlivable conditions. It's really about how, despite what's going on, people use their creativity to craft a different world.
Pleasure activism is very specific, and I know you've been practicing it as an academic, but also, beyond that too. Do you want to talk a little bit about that power of pleasure activism?
Yeah. So, I was in the book Pleasure Activism really by such happenstance. I happened to be went to grad school with Adrienne Maree Brown's assistant at the time, and I was bringing Adrienne to campus. And because of that, this person who then was Adrian's assistant knew that I had been involved in kink, knew that I was poly, and knew that I did disability studies. And so she was like, is it okay if I like let Adrian know that, you know, this other part of your life that she doesn't know about, because she's looking for more kink poly stuff in the book. And so I was like, yeah, sure. You know, I like love Adrian's work. And so we did this interview where she just sent me questions and I typed out a response and, you know, kind of edited it together. And I was very honest and open about my personal life in a way that I hadn't been, mostly because I thought it was going to be this niche publication that just went in, you know, in organizer spaces and like that sort of thing. And then it was a New York Times bestseller. And I was like, okay, well, guess that's out there. Like, guess that's out there now. And so it was so happenstance and so accidental. And it was absolutely the best thing to happen to me because it came out right as I was going up for tenure. And it just was like, well, here it is. Like, this is what I'm doing now. And so then when all these other things started kind of happening, like working with Lizzo and all this other stuff, I was like, well, I'm just going to lean into this, you know, I'm going to lean into this moment and into this framework because it really did bring together things that I was working on academically, the things that I believed in politically, and then things that I was engaging with in my personal life that I didn't make the same political connections between these things. And so it became this umbrella to be like, oh, all of this fits under this umbrella of pleasure activism. So it's been really great for me to just lean into that in my personal life of really embracing and trying to find more pleasure. I do a little column for a local outlet called UW-Madison, where I write every month a pleasure practices piece. And I just talk about like, here's what I'm doing right now to find pleasure. So like this month I wrote about like going to see holiday lights and putting up lights and kind of like fighting back against the, you know, 4:30 p.m. darkness that happens here. And then in professional life, I started to really lean into fashion in the classroom and wearing what I like. And I have a different outfit every day that I teach class. And for me, it's just become this creative practice that kind of like gets me a little bit excited, like, okay, it's time to go to class and I have this thing. And I think students sometimes notice and appreciate that as well. But yeah, it's really about finding spaces to bring more pleasure and joy into everything that I do in a way that just like makes life livable, you know, it makes life much more livable. And so if I can continue to bring that to everything I do, I think it's really fun and exciting. During the uprisings, I would like, yeah, wear beautiful outfits to go to protest because I was like, why not? You know, I think about the fact that folks who did sit-ins, you know, that they purposefully dressed up like they were going to church to be presentable and to be, and so mine's taking that in a different direction, but I'm like, people thought about clothing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't what folks wore every single day. They wore their Sunday best to go get hit by water hoses and have shit thrown on them at restaurant, you know, like that's, they knew what they were going into. And so I also was like, how do I bring this in a different way to our current moment? And so for me, it was wearing a lot of bright and colorful things. And then because I was often in charge of distributing food and water at protests, because I can't walk super long distances, so I was often the person in a car that was like in the front or the back of our marches and protests and such, that then I also was easy to find because they were like, oh, there's that like sparkly person over there that always has food, like let's go find her. So it worked on many levels.
So, you know, Devonya and I have had long conversations about this. I'm not sure if you know, Devonya was, along with Lydia Brown, part of my conversation in my book. We had a dialogue on intersectionality. And these are the kinds of issues that we continue to talk about as we are also in the academy and at the periphery, and finding ourselves kind of challenging the window dressing, because all that good intention masks all the ways in which the real labor is not being accounted for. And so Devonya and I talked at length about that unaccounted invisible labor that is dangerously, it makes precarious some of the most important knowledge bearing and knowledge making activity of the academy, especially moving forward. In forward thinking, a lot of your work, including Bodyminds Reimagined, which I found such be an important argument, is that the speculative quality of futural thinking, right? That labor of like planning and making for the future, especially as disabled folk, like it's hard to think about long-term sustainable strategies without a lot of things happening and a lot of structural kind of resources actively operating and working and not creating, sand in the gears and stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit more for me about that too? Because I think when I teach it in my classroom, and I think when I talk about it amongst my colleagues, the concept of body mind, and especially as scholars, I think we so have adapted to the mind versus body language. And I think how that can create a really hostile environment for us to do good practice in terms of models, but also as resources for our students. Can you talk a little bit about that in relation also to, because you talk about it in your other work too?
Sure. I think Devonya had some additional comments maybe around pleasure activism that she wanted to share.
Mostly one of the things, and I'm going to fangirl you a little bit. One of the things I like, especially what you do on Twitter, is this idea that one gets to bring one's whole self into the academy. And I think that goes with the aesthetic conversation that you were having. And that for me has always been a rich part of Black culture, that we are whole people, we are soulful people, our minds are in bodies and we are bodies in the world, and that reaffirmation of the joy of just being able to sing a song or be in the grocery store and be struck by a dance. I have a friend who says, we are dancing, singing people, and that's not a bad thing. It's been made a kind of controlling image, but it is also a part of a spontaneous expression of pleasure and joy in the moment of being. And to be able to bring that into the classroom, and when we talk about the artificiality of these, now cultural humility is starting to be used where I am, and belonging, and the artificiality of these things, I think, has a lot to do with the antiseptic ways in which we are approaching them, namely that we're not, even though they're asking us to bring ourselves, we're sort of units of diversity rather than whole people who are relationally engaged and enjoying the spirit of being with each other. So I think that it's been really neat to observe the sort of fashion comments, because when I first saw it, I'm like, why is she talking about fashion? And then I thought about it and I'm like, that is a kind of radical moment, that I'm not putting on whiteface in order to blend in, but I'm really expressing who I am in this aesthetic mode of being, not just because I'm trying to please somebody else, but because it's part of being embodied thinking and those kinds of things. So I like the idea of its connection to a tradition, to a lineage, which is stuff I've been thinking about.
I appreciate that. I think, I started my first job was in an English department, and I remember going to MLA, Modern Language Association conferences for interviews, and it was just like black suit, black suit, black suit, black suit, black suit. And I was just like, oh, this feels bad. And when I would put on the interview clothes, I didn't feel good. I didn't feel like myself. Like that lack of color is not me, and it actually is it feels stifling to me. It feels like don't do anything outside of this box, right? Like maybe someone would have a dangly earring, and that would be the little show of personality. And so when I was able to kind of break out of that, because I got a job in gender and women's studies, I was like, never again will I squash who I am to be in these spaces, so it became a real claiming of I am who I am here, and you hired me because of the work that I can do. So the way that I present myself should not be it shouldn't be a part of the equation here, but it is for so many reasons. So in terms of the concept of body mind, I talk about it in my first book, Bodyminds Reimagined, in terms of the relationship between body and mind and the way that they impact one another, so that we can really think of them as inseparable. And I talk about the fact that that separation of body and mind has been used against so many marginalized people, right? It's been used against people of color to say, like, your mind is not to the level of the rest of us. You are really embodied. It's been used against women to say, like, oh, you're menstruating, like your body now controls you and your mind is not as whatever, as if white men are just like heads in jars. And so it's been used against us in so many ways. But then also for the context of the book, because I was talking about speculative fiction, there was also this speculative element where body and mind was going to be melded and impacted in ways that go beyond our current reality. The way that I talk about it with my students and kind of a concrete example to try to get them to think about, what's the impact there. I'm going to use two things. One, I talk about depression. And I'm like, we think of depression as a mental disability, right? And yet some of the impacts, some of the side effects, symptoms of depression are often being lethargic, being extremely fatigued, tired, sleeping all the time, lack of appetite or over appetite, which are very bodily things that we're claiming is this mental disability. I also talk to them, for folks that may not understand the depression metaphor, because it's not something necessarily everyone gets. I ask them, have you ever been in one of those lecture halls, the old ones with the hard, narrow, terrible seats? And how much harder is it for you to pay attention when your body is uncomfortable? When your body is uncomfortable, your mind cannot operate in the same way, right? Because you're sitting there like, oh my gosh, fidgeting and moving around and doing all the things. So I'm like, every time your body is uncomfortable, it's impacting the way that you can show up. So that we can translate into folks with chronic pain, right? But I also think about folks with just like sensitivity to heat or temperature, right? That in the classroom, we have no control over the temperature in the classroom other than just like opening and closing windows and like trying to figure it out. And so all of those things impact your ability to like think clearly, to communicate clearly. And so I use those as some examples for folks to think about the fact that these are not separate, even though we often talk about them in that way. And in terms of like the work, I mean, there's so many things that need to be done. But if I'm thinking about in terms of disability and the academy, right, like some spaces that I'm most familiar with, for me, what I'm seeing right now is the need to really, not that we didn't already need to transform, but the increase in amount of disability among my students, among my colleagues, among staff, because of the pandemic, because of long COVID, because of trauma that folks experienced in the last couple of years, mental health wise, because of just the strain of having to do more care work, that there needs to be just a complete rethinking of access in the academy. And so for me, that is thinking about work from home, right? We all did it. And so allowing more flexibility with that in terms of staff, in terms of faculty teaching online. Here at UW, we had so many faculty were denied the request after the first year to teach online, that you really had to prove that you were immune compromised. And that was the only way. There was no other real consideration. Like if you had a child who was unvaccinated, for example, like all these other considerations, they just had no flexibility. And it was funny because then we came back and my students were like, oh, I wish there were more online classes. No professors are teaching online classes. And I was like, oh, baby, we wanted to do this and we were not allowed structurally. So I've been starting to teach students and provide them these news articles about faculty that were denied accommodations to help them get more of the larger context of what's going on. But I also think we need to transform our pedagogy. I think this idea of like the pace at which we were teaching, the quote unquote rigor that we were expecting has to shift. It really has to shift. And I really feel grateful that I had an incredible undergraduate mentor, Dr. Kathy McMahon-Klosterman. I will like shout her out until the end of time. She taught me so much about what it meant to be adaptable and flexible in the classroom, willing to just throw things out to be like, well, we're not doing that now. She used to say, don't let class get in the way of your education, in terms of like things happening on campus, whether that's events or protests. And she was like, yeah, skip class. Like, don't let class get in the way of your education of what is happening here on this campus. There are so many things and resources that might overlap with your class sometimes, and you can make another choice. And so this semester, for example, I could just feel the drain. I could feel that my students were not showing up. And, you know, it took me a couple of weeks to finally be like, let me just check in, figure out what's going on here. And I asked everybody on a scale of 1 to 10, how you're doing. And across the board, it was like 3, 4, 3, 4. And I was like, oh, y'all are not okay. You're not okay. And so we ended up having a conversation about what would it take to actually help you get through this semester, to move through. And so we ended up throwing out the readings. Instead, one day I like showed a short video that was on the same topic. And then I gave a little lecture and we had a conversation. I canceled the entire last week of classes. So this week I'm having one-on-one 10-minute meetings with every student to check in. And so some of them were talking about the finals. Some of them were talking about, okay, how do we just make sure you turn in enough work to pass, like whatever it needs to be. But really just being willing to throw things out. And I know that for some folks in STEM fields, like there may be a difference because I feel like there's a certain kind of building upon. And so I hope that folks that are in those fields like start to think more creatively. But I think especially for those of us in social sciences and humanities, we can figure out how to make these shifts and how to actually check in with our students, because who those students were at the beginning of the semester, who we were at the beginning of the semester, we don't know what is about to happen over the next couple of weeks. So I've been much more willing to be flexible and be creative in my pedagogy. And I think that with access at the center, right, is something that I really want to see folks lean into now, because I think in the midst of the push to return to normal, folks are like, okay, I can just like get rid of all that creativity and flexibility and skills that I learned over the last 2 years and go exactly back to what I was doing before. But we are still not, that world is not here. We are still living in a world where folks are sick all of the time, whether it's COVID or RSV or the flu, all these other things that are still going around. I had students with mono this year, like multiple students with mono. I think just really taking these lessons further is one of the big takeaways for students, like in the course of teaching our classes, but also for faculty and staff, because I think often like the disability inclusion aspects of universities are focused on access for students, and think very little about faculty and disabled faculty in any kind of way. I think care work is a great like resource to add into this, and thinking about what care work looks like in the context of the academy. And then the book is not out yet, but I wonder if we can still flag that it's coming out. So I don't think it has a date yet. But Mimi Cook's work, she has a book that will be coming out from Duke University Press. And I have no idea of the timeline of this because I was, an advanced reader kind of situation. But she has all of these like exercises and like interactive things, but also thinking about coursework and pedagogy that I just think is incredible. And I modeled some of the stuff that I have done this semester off of that, including she has her students work in care pods where they check in on each other and kind of like help hold each other accountable, but also just like have this space to be human with one another. And so now in one of my classes at the beginning of class for the first 15 minutes, they go check in with their care pods, and they like set a personal goal and like a work school goal for the next until the next session. And they like check in on what they were able to do. And when they first got put into care pods, I had them talk about like, what does care look like for you? What does being held accountable look like for you? So that they could talk about like, oh, I'm a person who needs cheerleading versus I'm a person who really needs someone to be like, did you do it? Did you do it? Did you do it? Right? Because that can be like effectively different for different people. So having them like really think about it. So now I'm trying to think about how to incorporate care pods from jump in my classes, because this was something I added after seeing Mimi's work and seeing how drained my students were around the Thanksgiving mark, that I was like, oh, we are struggling, you know. So her work in general, I think would be great. I'm trying to think who else.
I have Jay's academic ableism too. I'm going to bring some of that in, and in thinking a lot about, you know, using my disability studies, the critical disability theory work into classroom pedagogy. A lot of that is the CRIP time model, you know, giving them extension policies that are reasonable and but habitable, like because I think so many of my students, especially ones in STEM field sciences, they're in emergency mode and crisis mode all the time. I said, you know, there's no deadlines, there's due dates, like give birth to the baby, but please nobody dies. Just, you know, slow it down so that you can enjoy the experience of going to college and not have it be this constant risk taking to the point in which it becomes unsustainable. Like, and they don't know how to interpret these kind of what they perceive as softer policies or more flexibility. So I tell them things like, I'm the palate cleanser for those other classes. I'm the thing that you get to enjoy on the, you know, just don't forget about it. But like, I'm the thing that gets to complement that kind of strain and stress that they expect you to do in those classes. But I am feeling like I'm in dialogue with those colleagues.
I have a friend who says, you know, what the pandemic showed us is that things that used to hang together in a half-assed kind of way don't even do that anymore. And I think a part of what you're saying goes to the way in which we were pretending that certain things were working for people. And I think we've got to rethink what we mean by academic rigor. And this is something that I struggled with long before the pandemic. Like, if your measure of rigor is that I'm giving these tests and that I'm giving students tons and tons of work, what you're obscuring is the ways in which thinking is a process that needs time to unfold. And yes, students need skill sets, but the world more than anything else needs people who can think creatively, which I think goes back to what you all were talking about, that we see in speculative fiction, and these speculative qualities of theorizing is really located there. How do we begin to cultivate students and point to their success? It's sort of, with my students, and Jen and I have talked about this, they help me put together whatever test questions I'm giving them. It's helpful to me in terms of language. It allows me to review what they've done. And it also says there are no surprises here. I'm not trying to have a got you moment. That's not education. What I want is to facilitate you thinking through some things and thinking through them in ways that are meaningful to you so that you are invested in this process. Because I think there has to be an investment when someone says, I'm not letting class get in the way of my education. And in a lot of ways, we've stamped out that hunger. And the DEI work is sort of, let's bring these diverse bodies, but also mechanisms have to shift in order for us to understand the relationality of these diverse minds and bodies, because they come in, there's a whole set of learnings that are available to us to transform how we do things. So I agree. And the Academy still wants to go back to business as usual, which lost opportunity.
So the episode we're doing is on diversification and social justice. And I married these two concepts together specifically because we do see this wave of, still politically charged diversification initiatives across academia, in different kinds of educational settings. You do see that in institutional settings, even corporate settings. The push for diversification is has some legs to it, but with that comes, at least from the side of ethics, and when it intersects with all kinds of other social and political inequities and injustices, it really is hard to not see the cracks in the system. So I really want to start, maybe with a discussion about how social justice works in the work that we do, and then maybe work backwards toward like how diversification emerges out of a social justice commitment, and not just as a kind of like branding strategy, which is, I think that's what happens when it gets co-opted in a variety of environments. So talk a little bit about your work and your own experience with social justice, the social justice commitments as philosophers too. I think that not all philosophers know what social justice is, even if some of these ideas are part of the work we do, what it is to do the work and to be committed to social justice. And we could talk a little bit more about how it's connected to diversification.
The Mary Hooks quote that opens the entire book, which is the mandate for Black people in this time. And it ends with, to be transformed by the work. And so for me, I think bringing it back to this issue of diversification, and obviously my area, or the place that I am in, is mostly academia. So I know best through institutions and universities that, the diversity effort is very surface, it's very individual, it's very visual, right? It's about like, can we see all these different people here, but not really about qualitatively, what is their life like here? What does it feel like to be here as those folks? And then what structures need to change to actually support folks being and staying, right? I think as a queer, disabled, Black faculty member, I see so much turnover, faculty, staff, students leaving. And so there's such an emphasis on just the numbers, the stats, like what's the percentage of people we have here, rather than what's the quality of their life here, how long do they stay, that sort of thing.
How's it going? I'm DJ Mitchell, and I serve as Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Molloy University. I've been here for just over a year, so I started back in February 1st of 2022, and I would say it's been a whirlwind, but a good one. I've been building our DI initiatives across campus in partnership with Cabinet, which is the senior leadership team at Molloy, and also campus partners across the campus community. So that's what I've been doing for the past little bit over a year.
So can you talk to us, in your role too, do you talk to other DI officers across universities? Do you get to is there a larger community that you get to also draw from and work with?
I do. So there's a national organization called NADOHE, so the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. So we meet annually, and we do have some chapters locally. So I'm actually going to that conference next week, and that's just a conference where I get to refresh and talk with others across the nation and the world, actually, about what they're doing on their campuses. And sometimes this job can be lonely, especially when you're the only one in the office. So it's oftentimes good to attend those national conferences and talk with your peers, because they're doing the same types of things that you're doing on campus. Yeah, so before I got into the DEI space, I was a faculty member. So I spent 10 years in the classroom teaching the study of higher education. So how college students develop, how people govern higher education institutions. So I did that for 10 years, but my research really focused on race and racism and sexism, and then also identity intersection and intersectionality within higher education contexts. So I've always been doing this work, but sort of in a different way. I was in the academic lane, but then I transitioned over to being a chief diversity officer, if you will, and now I do this day-to-day, leaning on the research that I've conducted over the past decade. So I'll just highlight some of the initiatives that we've started here at Molloy University. So when I first started, I thought it would be important to have a university-wide DEI committee. So we have a DEI committee that advises me on some of our diversity initiatives. And this is a representation of faculty, students, staff, and administrators from across campus. So 28 people from across campus that really do the work hand in hand with me as we're building out my office structure. So that was one of the first initiatives that I started. Another initiative that we've launched is the DEI Faculty Fellows Program. So in partnership with our Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, we'll have 2 faculty members get a course reduction, or they'll teach one less course to work on a diversity initiative across campus. So some faculty, they're associate deans, some faculty, they're chairs, some faculty are program coordinators, but there's not always an opportunity for everybody to participate in those types of leadership activities. So this is another venue for those who are seeking leadership opportunities to participate, but it has that DEI focus. So our first 2 faculty fellows will focus on doing multicultural curriculum audits across campus. So they'll help our 4 schools, they'll help certain departments and work with individual faculty. And then our second faculty fellow is going to be helping with doing some educational programming around allyship and ableism. So we're excited to start that program, and I look forward to working with those 2 faculty members. And I'll just highlight one more initiative, and that's our campus climate survey. So we haven't done a university-wide campus climate survey related to DEI in our institution's history. So this semester, spring of 2023, we're launching our first campus climate survey. And we're just going to ask members of the community to talk about how they think we value DEI at the institution, and also any experiences with discrimination or harassment with the institution. So that just gives us data as we try to develop our DEI initiatives, so we can point to that data and use that data to inform our initiatives based on community feedback. So that's a few things that we have going on across campus.
When you do diversity work, it is culture shifting, right? So it's perspectives and narratives, and then providing alternative narratives or alternative frameworks to challenge maybe ways in which we can, improve the conversation, improve the access and support systems that are already operative. And I do think that's what happens sometimes with diversification work, is we end up with, thinking of the climate survey, only talking about the ills, right? And I'm an ethicist, so I tend to be the Debbie Downer of academia, like all the things that have gone wrong. And, this podcast is for the Center for Social and Ethical Concerns. So it is important that when we do talk about things that are really system-wide challenges, or addressing system-wide issues and trying to shift things, improve conditions, the resistance becomes labor. And I think it is really important to acknowledge the ways in which that labor is not traditional academic labor. And it's not really always the same as other kinds of administrative labor, which, I really appreciate your background in higher ed as a teacher, right, as an educator. The affinity groups was also something that I thought was really interesting. Can you tell everybody about what that is? Because I thought that initiative was so, it was a novel one I hadn't heard before, and just maybe how it's been going, what that's been looking like.
Yeah, so we've also started some employee affinity groups. some organizations call them employee resource groups. So what they are is they're groups where you coalesce on an identity or a shared interest. And one of the first groups that will be started here at Molloy is our Latino, Latina, Latinx affinity group. So that group will just, they'll be there to support our Latino, Latina, Latinx faculty, staff, and students. They'll do educational programming across the institution to improve our awareness around issues within that community. And then they'll just take time to hang out and enjoy each other. Part of employee affinity groups is the social networking piece. Because sometimes you might go a week or two without seeing someone who might identify with you or share certain things. So what these groups do is they pull employees together around a shared interest. And most of the time, though, that shared interest is identity based. So we're excited about having several groups being formed pretty soon. And even though these groups are based around a shared interest or an identity, it's always open to all employees. So no matter their race or ethnicity or sex, sexual orientation, or other identity markers, anybody can attend these groups, even though they work around that shared interest.
I do think that's an important aspect of diversity work and diversification as a real genuine initiative, is that it allows people to kind of organically form bonds and relations, and it isn't contrived by, kind of like an idealist, kind of position of like, well, we want this, so we're gonna put this in. I think, as a mom to a kid in the special education system, there was always this attempt to have the parents bond, and like, or, there was always this attempt to kind of create, the energy around even my kid, having her bond with, people, make friends and stuff like that. And I always felt like, well, it has to be environmental, I think, to be feeling like those are sustainable, right? So we have to allow for just creating a venue for people to enjoy each other's company and commune. And I think that really what that does is it does allow for more agricultural idea of like, we grow together, we are allowed to build a trust before we can then take on conflict.
Even though I provided the framework for these groups, they come from the ground up. So I don't start these groups on my own. So it comes from faculty or administrators or staff who get together, they build these groups. So we do provide a general framework and funding support, but it does come from the ground up. So I think that's why these initiatives often work out pretty well.
It really is hard to not see the cracks in the system. So I really want to start, maybe with a discussion about how social justice works in the work that we do, and then maybe work backwards toward like how diversification emerges out of a social justice commitment, and not just as a kind of like branding strategy, which is, I think that's what happens when it gets co-opted in a variety of environments. So talk a little bit about your work and your own experience with social justice, the social justice commitments as philosophers too. I think that not all philosophers know what social justice is, even if some of these ideas are part of the work we do, what it is to do the work and to be committed to social justice. And we could talk a little bit more about how it's connected to diversification.
Right. It's interesting how you asked the question, because if I have commitments to social justice, and by that, I think a lot about inclusivity, but also understanding at core the way our beliefs, our assumptions, our habits shape what becomes conscious to us and how we move through the world. And for me, that has always been the work of philosophy, to really dig deep down and understand those underlying assumptions, those tacit commitments, and how they play out in terms of our activity, what is more conscious to us. And I come from a tradition that is always asking, well, what is the motivation behind that? What are the underlying assumptions? And I think part and parcel of that has been survival. If you take the master narrative as given, it doesn't allow, or growing up, it wouldn't allow the possibility of one's thriving existence. So I always think there have been alternative models of joy, alternative models of our ideals, and ways of fashioning selves and communities despite being under pressure, under constraint. And so I see the work of creating a life despite constraint as the work of social justice, and ultimately in the interest of removing those constraints that inhibit thriving. And I'm being a little vague because I think one of the things that often happens when we talk about social justice is that we have normative ideals toward which we want to shape the world. And I'm not critiquing normative ideals as aspirational goals. However, if we begin with the ideals, we often don't attend to the ways in which those ideals fail, or we pretend that when we fall short of those ideals, it's just a kind of fly in the ointment, for lack of a better description. And I think thinkers like Iris Marion Young and Charles Mills address this in their work. And for me, it becomes very salient when we talk about things like equity and inclusion and diversity, because the distinction between what we might describe as performative inclusion, namely, we are gesturing toward an inclusion, but we're not challenging any of the existing structures. I think it often grows out of this sense that all we need to do is put diverse bodies in these spaces, and that alone will make a difference. And so in this work of philosophy, for me, it has always been work of intervention, work of critique. And by critique, I mean asking those deep questions. I don't mean criticism as such, as much as spirited engagement and asking questions. What is it that we are attempting to do? How are we defining justice? And is it possible to build justice out of an unjust system? And I think these are some of the kinds of questions that Afro-pessimism asks, and I'm not arguing that I align necessarily with Afro-pessimism, but I think some of their conclusions about the intransigence of anti-Black racism, the intransigence of forms of anti-disability justice, and failures of our systems and institutions to be fully inclusive, are often about imagination, theoretical frameworks, and most importantly, how these habits of mind that become habits of action, shape us and shape what becomes conscious for us.
What you're describing as the more, the deeper forms of intervention and interrogation that are really what can address system failures, right? So, or what can address the more systemic, the more pervasive injustices that can easily be masked by those strategies that kind of like skim the surface of the issues that might be, current, and to some degree make it appear as if the resolution is there, right? It lives at the surface, and it also can be resolved at the surface. And I think this is also what always attracted me to philosophy, and also I think for many, many years contributed to the depth of our friendship is to be able to really spend time with a work of interrogation and thinking about how those interrogations are not merely speculative, that they are very worldly, and they aren't armchair exercises, which I think a lot of the people that we would work and study with, it was for them, a leisure activity. For us, it was a survival activity, I think, in a way that was remarkably different. And I always felt like
it is something that I talk with my students about, being here in Buffalo, and in light of the mass white supremacist shooting at the Tops Market. I was gifted to have students who worked with me, who have gone on to take some of that theorizing about the world into their healing practices in Buffalo's Black communities. And to hear students talk about the power of something like parousia, frank truth-telling, to take this idea that philosophy is not simply about some abstract, speculative armchair situation, but that we engage in this theorizing to change the world, to create the world that we would like to see. It becomes a very powerful impetus to action, and not merely action, but thoughtful action, well-educated action. And by well-educated, not necessarily academically educated, but having done that investigation, having done those interrogations, questioning exactly what it is that one is about when one engages the world. And those things have been very meaningful for me to see people actually take things out of the classroom and into the world, but also to bring things from the world into the classroom. I think often students have experiences of obstacles and challenges in life, and they understand them in an experiential level, but they have not necessarily theorized about those experiences. They haven't necessarily put them together in ways that aid them in making sense and understanding the institutional and systemic connections. And I also think that is work that philosophy can do, a kind of descriptive modeling of structures as they exist. And that work of understanding, for example, the way something like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or TikTok utilize these embedded algorithms to promote certain imaging of Blackness, of Black people, of disabled people, of other racialized sorts of people, to be able to say, well, what is it that I am consuming? How does this contemporary version of Blackface or brown face or Asian face, how do these things play out in ways that reproduce the very controlling images that we have historically sought to challenge? And they come back to us in different ways with different costuming, but they often remain embedded in our very structures. And I think for me, philosophy has been an extension of that interrogative practice that I learned growing up in Mississippi.
I think too, when you mention about, and I think this is part of the kind of, kind of insight of what you describe. And I use this in my teaching practices with a lot of my ethics courses, is that question of how do you build justice out of an unjust system, right? This idea of like the work of doing any kind of justice work at the end of the day is a kind of accountability to the injustices, and to what degree those injustices make impossible any kind of conversation about justice moving forward, right? So that strategies then become that further interrogation about what makes injustice so much more the material reality of a system than any kind of naming of anything as if it were justice, right? And when you mention about the habits of mind into the habits of action, I'm thinking a lot about, there's this kind of choreography that emerges, right? This kind of dance we do that kind of affirms itself in the normalization of certain kinds of habits, adaptations to systems that are failed or failing, or coping with those systems as they are unjust systems, right? And becoming complicit to whatever degree or wherever we are within that framework. And what I like about some of the work you're doing, especially with the work on Black Vernacular, and you may have to talk a little bit more about Parisia for the people listening, is the way in which there's a breaking with the choreography. Sometimes the breaking with the choreography is part of the labor, and sometimes it's these new choreographies, these new ways in which the dance, the cycling in of the script is now edited and altered, and and I think your appeal in your work to blues and to jazz is part of that, and the ways in which they can be, right, like genuinely but joyfully subverted in, like you said, the way we fashion how we're
Yes.
engaged in the world, and how we fashion ourselves in relation to those engagements.
Well, I think when we talk about this concept that comes out of Greek philosophy that is appropriated, so to speak, by Foucault, what is of interest to me in that conceptualization is that it offers a mechanism to understand how someone deemed not to have power has a mechanism to call to ethical account someone who is in a position of power. We often think about people who are powerless as simply oppressed. And a lot of the work that I'm beginning to think about is, how do we shift that narrative? Because if you are oppressed, there's a way in which your agency is compromised. Now, don't take me to mean that people who exist under systematic constraint can just make whatever decision they want, or just jump up and do anything they want, or just say, I'm no longer going to take this. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, within those constraints, people often exercise the agency that they do have, or they create other forms of agentive behavior. And I think there is a history of that. I certainly believe that the tradition I grew up in, the Black radical tradition, is one of those traditions where people continually assess their conditions and they create strategies and tactics that allow them various forms of freedom, even as they operate under conditions of unfreedom. And so for me, one of the ways through academic philosophy to talk about these practices has been to use this concept of parsia as a way to think about what one can call into account from an ethical and political standpoint. And for me, there is an intersection between ethics and the political. And for a lot of philosophers, that is not the case. But it is hard for me to see them as very discrete entities. Yes, they have different operations, but I think when we're talking about our ethical commitments and our ethical behaviors, they often map out into very politicized ways. Political because they are about being within networks of power and organizing power with respect to certain interests, either promoting dominant or status quo interests, or working to shift the focus from those. And so if we think again about these kinds of practices, we also have to think about different ways of knowing. And that's something that Christy Dotson has done a lot of work around. She's a Black feminist epistemologist. And so while I'm not an epistemologist, I think it is super important to be aware that the dominant tropes that are often operative, especially in a discipline like philosophy, are not the dominant tropes of all cultures, of all people. And I think people like Audra Simpson in Indigenous studies and doing work around indigeneity, Mashona Gorman, those sorts of people are beginning to talk to us about different conceptions of world building that are grounded in those indigenous traditions. And I think there are similar, often parallel, often intersecting traditions that also come out of Black culture that not only offer us interventions into disciplines like philosophy or anthropology, but they offer us different ways to think the problems that we're addressing. And for me, that is part of what we get when we think about something like a Black vernacular. It is a system, it is a collection of knowings, of ways of talking, of ways of being that are plural, that are emergent, and that also understand their differences from the status quo and dominant modes that are much more accepted. And so increasingly, it seems to me, as we're looking at the brokenness of our world in this contemporary moment, it makes sense to look to people who have struggled with that kind of brokenness for centuries, for millennia, that there are ways in which if you have been made marginal, if you have been othered with respect to dominant culture, you have existed in a structural brokenness, which is not sustainable. So you've had to create ways of being, ways of celebrating, ways of having joy that are more than mere survival. And how do we begin to talk about those things? And for me, talking about it has really been thinking deeply about this distinction we're drawing between oppression and unfreedom, for example. There's a way in which, if I say I am oppressed, it is a narrative of a condition, but it also mutes the ways in which I am rejecting or refusing those forms of oppression. And so I think for me, unfreedom is a much more succinct way to talk about a critical stance with respect to these conditions that I don't have overarching control over, and conditions that I want to work against, that I'm actively pushing against and actively refusing, and where I'm working not to be complicit. And for me, that is the work of social justice. It is an ongoing enterprise. It is an ever expanding set of understandings that have to be negotiated. And again, as we were talking about the idea of ideal theory or ideal justice, I think for me, this has been a problem with beginning with the ideal structures of justice, the sort of normative standards, because most people don't understand the ways in which injustice is constructed and perpetually animated despite attempts to undo injustices. And I think it is also the case that when we have habits of mind and habits of action, we often are not aware what comes into the frame may not include things that help us understand the ways in which built environments can be exclusionary, the ways in which academic settings can also be exclusionary. And I think a lot about disability justice when I'm thinking about built environments, that you can say you want to invite people who have mobility differences into a room, into a conversation. But if you have stairs as the entry point, then the built structure precludes them from getting into the room. And the conversation in the room is, how do we get more people with mobility differences into the room? But you haven't thought about the framework that is preventing entry even before the conscious conversation begins. And for me, that is a lot of what one must do in thinking differently about how we approach social justice, but how we think about these ideas of ethics and justice as practices, right? Not just theoretical positions, but as practices that we need to engage in, that we need to tune, that we need to adjust.
I think there's something really important too about this, because I think when we talk about, especially with whatever politically charged aspects of diversification emerge, a lot of it tends to lean in to this question of intention, what people mean to do, what they don't mean to do, and it not really remedying or even beginning to address that actually can further harm the people who are already kind of at the margins of those systems that are unjust. And so I keep thinking about that the approach that you're taking as an undermining of, or maybe even a bracketing off, if we want to be phenomenological about it, of what people think or feel or how they opine or what they intend is irrelevant. Like the best wishes sometimes are the most harmful, because it really kind of evades the ability to be responsible. Again, my work has been out of Emmanuel Levinas. Devonya and I have been talking many years about the work of Emmanuel Levinas. But I do think this kind of escape from responsibility, an infinite, endless responsibility to others in the world, in the way in which we are existentially bound. We are, in this way, the novelty of being, right? Being in the world is not something that we can take as kind of on a mass scale, as if it could be paired off and cleaned up and organized with some intention, right? And again, he's a post-Holocaust ethicist, so you can imagine how important it is that we suspend this idea that you can intend to organize, or in a almost kind of idealistic way. I think that's like eugenics proper, is to be able to like organize who is being in the world and how they are in the world with direct intention.
I also think it goes to this distinction. You bring up Levinas, and there's this distinction between a responsibility to an other who I can understand as a rational being versus a responsibility to an other that is beyond my understanding. And I think we spend a lot of time assuming that if we can simply explain the condition, if we can simply understand the experience of someone, if we can show the videos of police, of state-sponsored violence against bodies of color, if we can just show the video enough times, people will rationally conclude that this is wrong. And you allude to the kinds of damage and the kinds of consumption that that promotes. And I think the question of who's doing the work becomes key here, because what kind of work are those videos doing? And I think the people who circulate them believe that they are doing a work of making people conscious. For me, it is often re-traumatizing. And it has the added dilemma of sort of muting the response of shock to such things. They become so commonplace. It becomes a pattern of seeing the violent death of people of color. And that has its own issues and its own forms of commodification for various interests. And I think those are things that we have to interrogate even as we are moving toward wanting to raise awareness and make changes to structures. And so the idea not only of rational norms to which we adhere, but the question of what are the limits of rationality in those respects? What are other structures of aspirational goals? What are other forms of pursuing non-ideal ideals? How can we mobilize those to talk about what we want, but also to negotiate what, under given conditions, constitutes something that is just? Because I don't think we really know what is just. What we know is a condition of injustice. And I think people like Charles Mills and Iris Marion Young, among others, have really turned the tide of political philosophy by saying to us, we need to begin by theorizing and narrating injustice before we can even begin to work out what justice might be. And I find that it is a case that people understand it's wrong, but they don't necessarily understand the inner workings that continue to perpetuate these injustices. They don't necessarily understand that many communities are, for all practical purposes, occupied by military forces, that they are over-policed, that they are under-resourced in terms of social programs, in terms of educational opportunity, in terms of job opportunities, with respect to financing businesses. And these are structural. Some of them go to suburbanization that is parallel to urbanization. Some of them go to practices around the war on drugs. They're all kinds of intersecting and enmeshed practices that perpetuate. So when we talk about just the surface, just representation, we miss the ways in which representation does not speak to the perpetual ways in which there are limits. And we can all see success stories, but I think what we miss when we look at the success stories are the ways in which that one success sends a signal that anyone can do it, rather than how miraculous it is that this person has achieved something against all odds. And I think that's, again, a framing that must come from theorizing about injustice, not simply ideal notions of justice. And I really think that's, for me, the kinds of interventions that ethics needs to do, not only understanding it from the standpoint of single actors, but in terms of communities and conditions. And I think that is an important piece of, for me, Black radical tradition, among other kinds of traditions that are often saturated in sound too. And when we talk about Black vernacular, music is crucial to that. It is an integral component, not simply music that we play, but this musicality and rhythm and mode of engaging the world as not simply as harmony, not only in the way we might bend notes or play notes, but the idea that an ensemble of players is always in negotiation. If you're going to play a piece, you're engaged in a community and an emerging negotiation. You're not performing for, you are performing with, and that includes the audience. So the performance is not separate from the audience. We are not performing for, we are engaged in an act in this very moment of building a provisional kind of community, and that is interactive and emergent. And I mean, I really hear it with music. And so for me, some of this is, how do we shift from a lot of the visual metaphors that philosophy relies upon, and what are we missing if we're only seeing and not also hearing? That those can be integrative acts, and the hearing is key. So I think those methodological practices, even though they get a lot of grief, I think they are interesting for our imagination, and interesting because they push us to begin to think about what is not present, what we miss, and also the kind of labor that goes into making those things visual. I think Audre Lorde called them sweaty concepts, that they require a lot of work to bring into frame, and there is not an easy, there's not an easy repertoire from which one can pull to make them visible. And I think that's the kind of labor you've been talking about, the labor of diversity work, the labor of equity and inclusion work, which is not simply bringing the work and pushing against institutions, but also working to get people to register the things that they pass by or believe are insignificant. And it is a work often of translation, a work often of indicating that there needs to be further negotiation, and a work of questioning who gets to take the lead in that. If you're showing up to help, for example, which is a lot of the kinds of service learning things that we are engaged in, you've already missed who gets to take the lead, because you're presuming that you know what communities need, what communities want, and you're not asking them. And again, someone who's looking at that, because often in the academy, we are people who have a foot in multiple communities, and often in communities where institutions where we wear different hats are stepping in and And as people in the community were like, what are they doing? As members of the institution, we might think, oh, we could do that better, or we can do that in ways that are not colonial. We can do that in anti-colonial ways. And so that work of translation, that work of bringing people to see what might not be visible, to hear what might be silent, is important. And it is a work of relationship building. It is a work of not presuming that we're operating from the same symbolic structure, from the same tropes, or that we might read those tropes different.
Again, inclusivity is one of those things that also does this, that when we're including, at least when we're using, some more ideological strategies, we are kind of assuming that there always has to be different people in the room at the same time. And what I've learned in disability studies is that, there's the interloper problem. Very often, communities who have been made precarious by a society need to have time to themselves. Like, there are also ways in which exclusion becomes a really important solidarity, or kind of collecting of resources effort. In other words, the armor is accumulated, because sometimes it is, and I think of Bell Hooks too on this, where she talks about the idea of home as repair, theory as healing. She's always talking about kind of like the larger battle sometimes really is not done individually, but done because there has been this time building community, and that community has been a kind of access intimacy where we kind of, who it is that is alongside of you and who is truly in solidarity. And again, the contrivance, the choreography, very often, do we get the space to build those kinds of communities? And the last thing I want to add to that, because this is where it connects to what I talked about with DJ, was he built what's called affinity groups on campus, where people get to, like, with common interest, just create their own kind of club. And it's not really like a club. They get to, like, make their own rules and decide how they want to run it, and decide what events they want to do, or just hang out and socialize.
I'm smiling because they, when my daughters were at a friend's school, they had affinity groups, and they were often racial and ethnic affinity groups. And one of the big, and this is a very progressive place, or presumed to be a very progressive place, but parents were upset that students of color had their own affinity group that didn't include white students. And they're like, but our students don't have an affinity group. And it was impossible for them to appreciate the need for students to be in affinity groups. And I want to kind of slant that conversation a little bit differently, so that it is not only a kind of retreat from the world as it is, but when we talk about inclusion, what are we inviting people to be included in, right? So the cost of being included often requires shedding some of who you are in order to be in that room. And something like the I Ching says, look, fellowship begins before we walk through the door. And often there are not questions about the invitation to be included. What are the conditions of that invitation? Am I being asked to assimilate? And am I being asked to somehow fit myself into a model of who you think should be at the table? Or put differently, am I being invited to simply be in this Black body, but not very different than anybody else at the table, merely a diverse body, not necessarily a diverse set of interests or a different viewpoint. And to me, that becomes very important, especially as we talk about diversifying predominantly white institutions, because for people coming in, there's a lot of labor and there's a presumption that one will explain oneself, or that people are owed an understanding of one's experience. And I think it is important to know that, and this goes to your point about access, intimacy, one must earn the right to someone's story. You don't get it just by virtue of being well-intentioned or by virtue of extending an invitation to sit at the table. You have to earn the understanding that you can bear the weight of the story and allow the story to exist as it is, as it unfolds. And I think that is super important, because that labor of being the person included, and I think Denise James, another philosopher, talks about this around fights for integration. You've got children who are the leading warriors in these fights for integration, and we may celebrate them and they are heroic, but what is the cost of that? And what is the kind of ontological fatigue and existential exhaustion that emerges from being a perpetual translator, from being someone who is expected to narrate the story, to create the spaces of inclusion for the benefit of institutions that often are not doing what is necessary to support and sustain, both from a health standpoint and a resource standpoint, to sustain the very diversity that they desire. And I think this is a huge, huge issue, that institutions often want diversity, but are not necessarily prepared to actually resource that diversity in the multiple ways that resources are needed, be it sustaining the mental health and well-being of people doing that work, be it actual dollars, be it time, be it recruitment efforts, be it those moments where people need to collect in a shared space and think about strategy. And that's important. And I think increasingly social justice movements are thinking more deeply about those experiences of burnout, of the mental health realities of this kind of work, and the exhaustion that often results from the inordinate amount of what I call unacknowledged or under-acknowledged labor.
Yeah, and it's up to you if we want to include it or not, but I know that you would also describe the concept of world weariness. And I always found that really an important kind of way of describing the very, very unique kind of exhaustion that comes when you've been positioned to do this kind of labor, and it isn't something that is reinvested in. In other words, we kind of like exhaust the resource, like we're mining for oil, but at some point it just is going to run out, right? So and again, I love that we're kind of continuing to affirm a larger argument about diversification through social justice models not being about intention. And again, the best plans for diversification cannot be made by certain kinds of people in certain kinds of positions in the abstract. it is something that can create a lot of harm to a lot of stakeholders in a variety of ways. That I think that's where, when I'm thinking about some of the work of the podcast here, is talking about the new and urgent ethical social issues. With diversification, social justice, I really do feel that that is one of those things that we can put an alarm on, is, diversification initiatives, when they are crafted, are already working at an error. They're already working in a way that I think I want to be able to kind of do that interrogative work or intervene. Like, I think that's where the interventions can begin, is
Right.
what would it really look like to reassess an initiative, the way we distribute the money, who the role players are and what roles they play, doing it in ways that borrow from different kinds of sets of questions,
Right. And what does it
models of
mean to
interrogation.
and what does it mean to ask who's not at the table, and what are the causes that bar them from being able to be at the table, rather than who do we need to get at the table. I think, to your point, intention alone is not enough. I also think institutions have to be deliberate in their commitments to diversify. So it's a kind of both and, right? There's got to be a will to make things different, but there's also got to be an understanding that for things to be different, one cannot proceed in the usual ways. There has to be more creativity and getting people differently engaged. And we have to think about the kinds of things that institutions value and ask questions about what are additional values, right? What are things that enrich institutions that might not be as heavily valued? For us, for example, we talk about the idea of service. I mean, that's one of the criteria upon which we are evaluated as faculty. And people are like, well, yes, you have to do service, but scholarship is always going to trump service. Well, why are we arguing that service is just incidental, especially if we are wanting to build institutions that are more inclusive? Isn't the work of service, or certain kinds of service work, isn't that also about scholarship in some ways? Namely, how do we understand people with whom we want to work? How do we understand their history? How do we understand their theoretical frameworks? And how do we value the labor of building genuine relationships, not presuming that we can simply be in community with people without building those meaningful relationships? So just quickly, Immersion Eastside grew out of a couple of things, and I'll shorthand it. One of the things is that often we go across the world to understand conditions through which people have been made marginal, and we rarely do it in our own backyards. And it seems to me of extreme importance to understand how people who are our neighbors have been under-resourced, have been made marginal. And often we are much more critical of people who we are close by. And so that immersion experience, really, how do we privilege community-based folks as experts and knowers and activists and political change agents, as opposed to assuming that we as academic institutions are actually going to help. This is also part and parcel with looking at how often service learning can reinforce the very stereotypes in controlling images that we seek to undermine. That students going in without background knowledge, without more systemic and structural knowledge, often see played out what they are expecting. And I think that way of thinking can do harm, and then putting people into positions where they see themselves as helping without understanding how the people they are helping see them can be challenging. So what's exciting me? I think music. I find myself returning to bebop, which is something that I have loved for a long time. I think I am very excited about learning more about what's going on in Indigenous studies and the ways in which that model has always not accepted these external impositions of what indigeneity is. Also, these anti-colonial gestures that are going on, and how Indigenous worlds are understood by the various communities that are part under that umbrella. So that's very exciting. I am excited about things that are going on in the disability justice movement, sort of new writing, how people are beginning to think in terms of race and disability, but also understanding the ways that race has been pushed out of disability conversations. And I think this is going to be even more pressing as we look at the impact of COVID, that not only are we thinking about new ways to work, but I think we're going to have to think a lot about the ways in which people have been changed by long COVID, by engaging and negotiating a pandemic. And so I'm interested to see what comes out of that. Excited to see this growing concern with mental health and wellness as something that people talk about actively, not just something that happens behind closed doors, and greater concern with healing forms of trauma, and also digging down into joy, thinking about how we organize ourselves for social justice differently and more effectively. So those are the kinds of things that are of interest to me and that are kind of animating me.
I'm teaching one of the doctoral classes in education, and we've been talking a lot about how intersectionality works, how diversity works in education, and we've been talking a lot about challenging performativity in the work that we do. Performance oriented initiatives where we just put on the airs, put on the costuming, and I think the performative has been acceptable in compliance culture, but I think when we genuinely labor on quality diversification in our institutions, especially when they are educational environments, or in some cases in medical environments, or any environments in which there's caretaking work and caretaking labor, one of the common themes throughout the episodes for the season has been that we really want to acknowledge and appreciate the kind of caretaking labor that goes into removing the performative qualities and the compliance aspects and making it, an authentic engagement. As educators who draw from the literature really know, my last interview I just had, we talked about Bell Hook's work, Teaching to Transgress, and how the engagement is non-hierarchical, that we really want to make sure that we kind of approach the question of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this really lateral way. So it's a stakeholder model. It's not like there's initiatives and then we kind of drop down and reach out and catch people like we're fishing, but something more in the lateral sense. The framework is we all start at some common ground and start to cultivate things from that. Really, for me as an educator, and when I'm talking to future educators, I find that there's actually a deep hunger for that. That, oh, we can do that. Is this allowed? So it's how much it's been a neglected strategy, but it can be such an empowering one.
And it's
when we're
that's
able to
really,
kind of like draw from it.
yeah. And you're making such great points. And as you can imagine, that's really difficult in a vice president role, because it's part of a hierarchy, but you're leading DEI work that you want to be authentic and everything. So you have to find a balance between those two, working within the system, but also trying to break apart the system that prohibits full inclusion and diversity and equity. So excellent points, and that's something I work through every day, wearing this hat, but also wanting to see true change at Molloy and in broader communities.
Yeah, and I think I just ended one of my classes content with the question of moral imagination. I talked a little bit about Maxine Green's work and how, as working in the education field for so long, working on the question of imaginary becomes a really good opportunity to kind of allow for multiple voices, multiple competing interests, and yet still be fruitful and not be like antagonism in the ways in which multiple perspectives may not line up and should not line up. They don't have to line up and can be aesthetically cacophonous. We can have the multiple voices be kind of a little bit disorienting, a little jarring, a little disharmonious, and yet still find deep love for the sound of it, for the quality of the noise, right? The playful, joyous noise. Again, there has to be ways in which we frame those settings so that we can do that work. And we have to be a little protected in that work too. We can't be questioned outright unless you let the room like take the noise, take the opportunity to be loud and to be disconnected, because connections have to be, like I said, organic and again, play into the imaginary and not the kind of like, check boxes. And I think that's also what destroys a lot of quality diversification work is it becomes like a checkbox thing, check, we got the race, we got the, gender, we got the race, gender, class. And of course, my work in disability studies, we always forget, oh yeah, disabilities, it's own category of diversification of human experience and knowledge and things like that. So what's giving you life right now? What's exciting you? What are you looking forward to?
Family is definitely precious. Also enjoy sports. So when I want to refresh after a long day or a difficult day, because you have those sometimes when you do DI work. I like to enjoy sports, so basketball, football. Then we like to travel a bit as a refresh. So we started a tradition a couple years ago. So during the Thanksgiving break or November break, we'll just find a country or somewhere to travel to. And most recently, we went to Jamaica. So seeing my family, sports, and travel is how I regroup after some of this work. So
I appreciate that too. I think when we talk about doing work that's very labor intensive, especially in a professional lens. And I do talk about this with my students, that there's work been done. I'm going to mention Eva Katay's piece. She called it "The Personal is Political is Philosophical." And, she was a mother of a disabled daughter. And as a philosopher, she went up against a very well-known philosopher who challenged the idea that, like, a disabled person has a life of suffering. So is their life as valuable as, say, an animal who maybe we want to free of suffering? Very famous. I'm not going to mention. He will be not named in my podcast. But Eva Katay's work for me was very motivating, because I found that I was able to take stuff that was personal, that was very trivialized in my academic environments. Like, if you are too personal, or if you draw from the personal too much, it was considered as softer or not as legitimate. But I could not bring who I was into the work I did, because I was so passionate about it. And so I always knew I had to be very protective over the things that were personal to me, but they became catalysts for me really doing what I thought was really contributing to things in the field. In particular, the book on ableism, where I talk, actually, my first chapter is on the problem of allyship and ableism. So I'm glad you mentioned it, one of the initiatives there. And some of the problems with allyship as, a function, famously, and this is for the listeners, the idea of like cookies, that when you do, you're a helper and you're at the periphery of a stakeholder group who you're meant to, like, take care of or help, what that can do very often is make it out to be that your labor deserves reward, like, oh, but I deserve a cookie for all the good work I do. And making sure that quality stakeholder communities build allyship as without needing this kind of, like we said already, performative, but this reward system built in there, that there is a way in which the community is a collection of resources, and then everyone draws when they need from that resource collection. So the quality of that kind of work, for me, that labor of love, very much within the mission of Molloy as well. And I think that's what I've also really found welcoming about Molloy, because they're like any institution working in diversification work, you're already going to bump into many obstacles. I think the way we work not just efficiently and we're protective over the work that we do, but that we are still passionate and it's sustainable and rewardable in a longer, we play the long game, I think becomes really important. And I think that's why it's important to me to know that you are able to kind of find ways to keep yourself joyful, keep yourself
definitely.
And I think family is such an important part of that.
Family is a.
Where else have you gone for travel? Where else have you gone?
So our first trip was to London, in Dublin. So that was one and the same. And then we've also done a cruise in the past during that break. So we've traveled many places during Thanksgiving break, but it's pretty exciting.
What's on the list?
What's on the list next? I've never been to Paris. I would love to visit Paris. My wife has taken me to Ghana, so that was a really good experience. But next, I'd like to do Paris or a larger Asian city. I know Asia is quite big, but I haven't been to that continent yet.
That's exciting. Okay, so I think if there's anything else you wanted to add, or any other thoughts in terms of, like, part of the title is diversification and social justice, things that you want to comment on about the question of social justice, especially in relation to the role you play, or any other kind of, like, additional comments.
I'll just give a shout out to my grandmother, Sarah Irene Harris. She recently passed on March 1st of this year. And just to see how people honored her during her passing, it's just how I want to live my life and how I want to do my work. I was raised by, I would say, 3 Black women. So Sarah Harris is one of those women. My older sister, Christic Prout, and then of course my mom, who's my rock, Patricia Ricks. So those three women, even though my grandfather was there, my stepfather was there, I know my biological father, those three Black women raised me into the man I am today. So I do want to give a shout out to them, but in particular, my grandmother, who I just lost, because Black women often fall in the cracks because of intersectionality. So highlighting their stories and their voices is something that's important. So shout out to them.
DJ, thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate your time. I hope you found our conversation enriching. I want to pause to acknowledge that Molloy University is located on the lands once home to Indigenous peoples, including the Lenape, the Montaukett Indian Nation, and Indigenous peoples who resided in the Massapequa, Merrick, and Rockaway territories. We recognize the long and complex history that has brought us to these lands, and we seek to understand the ongoing impact of settler colonialism and its influence on the cultures and heritages of Indigenous peoples. We remember and acknowledge our connections to Indigenous peoples and appreciate the opportunity to live and learn on this land. We honor the Indigenous peoples of the past, today, and in generations to come. I would also like to thank my guests today and our student production interns, Jenna Tarini, Natalie Peralta, our student editorial interns, Kyle Aramiscus and Joe Maffetone. Much thanks goes to Kim Geary and Liz Mandrakia for their administrative and promotional support of the podcast, and the Office of the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and the Faculty of the Philosophy Department at Molloy. I appreciate all of the help and assistance. For any questions or concerns or comments or ideas for future podcasts, please email us at csec@molloy.edu. Thanks again for joining us.